A true history of slavery and resistance begins with the story of the people who were enslaved. Before Africans were taken to the Americas, they lived rich and varied lives as citizens of many different nations. They crafted tools and weapons out of iron and made clothing from the woven fibers of palm leaves. Those who lived near the ocean fished and made salt by boiling seawater in clay jars. Other African people were farmers. They grew rice, yams, and a kind of grain called millet. They raised oxen, cows, horses, pigs, goats, and dogs. They brought their crops and animals to huge markets, where thousands of people came to find the goods their families needed. Africa had vibrant economies and organized governments. Even in big kingdoms, many people were involved in decision-making. The kingdoms of Africa had figured out a thing or two about democracy before the United States of America was even a thought, much less a nation on a map. All that time, African people were making art and developing scientific ideas. They built several great, huge libraries and passed down knowledge from generation to generation. Researchers have rediscovered thousands of ancient African manuscripts focused on everything from religion to mathematics to astronomy. Slavery was also part of life in Africa, and that comes as a surprise to some people. But America didn't invent slavery. The practice goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, and Africa too. Historically, people hadn't been enslaved based on the color of their skin. In ancient times, slavery was most often a way to take advantage of those who had been captured during war. That began to change in the 1400s, when Portugal started bringing enslaved people from Africa to Europe. You might be wondering how anyone could justify stealing people away from their homes and forcing them to work on another continent. Even way back then, Europeans tried to justify it by claiming that African people were inferior to people from Europe. A Portuguese writer likely helped that idea along. Gomes Llanos de Zurara was a royal chronicler, which meant he was in charge of writing the official history of his nation. He wrote that African people were living like beasts, without any custom of reasonable beings. He said that if people weren't living peacefully under a government with laws, they really weren't people at all, so it was fine to enslave them. We know none of that was true. African people had kingdoms and thriving economies, along with great knowledge of science, math, and architecture. Many people in Europe certainly knew that too. But the racist idea that Africans were somehow inferior took hold. Other Europeans wrote similar things. For centuries, the works of Europeans erased the real history of African people and replaced it with one that would justify their enslavement. At first, this new slave trade mostly brought African people to Portugal and Spain. Then Christopher Columbus came along. There are enough myths about Columbus to fill an entire book. But for now, it's enough to know that his explorations opened the door on a whole new era of enslavement. At first, Columbus was sending enslaved people from the Caribbean back to Europe. These were Taino men and women he'd captured from the islands where they'd lived their whole lives. The Spanish enslaved native people and forced them to work in the Caribbean too, in gold mines on the island of Hispaniola. When those early European explorers arrived in the Americas, they brought along diseases. Native people had no immunity to the new germs, so smallpox and other illnesses ravaged Hispaniola. Less than 20 years after the arrival of Columbus, the native population had dropped from as many as 3 million to just about 25,000 who were still able to work. That's when the Spanish began bringing enslaved people across the ocean, a practice that was marked by cruelty and brutality at every stage. In 1510, King Ferdinand II gave his approval for 50 enslaved African people to be sent from Spain to Hispaniola to work in the gold mines. 3 weeks later, the king ordered another 200 enslaved people to be shipped across the sea under cramped, filthy conditions and forced to work in the mines. This was the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade.